Here is a fact from history that almost no one tells without embellishment. In ancient Rome, a bride did not simply get married. She was publicly stripped of her choice. In one of the most brutal wedding rituals, a woman was forced to resist, dragged away against her will, and turned into part of the spectacle where her fear was considered a virtue and her silence was treated as consent. And what is even more disturbing, all of this happened not in darkness, but amid laughter, applause, and public approval. Rome called it tradition, a symbol, a part of order. But if you look closely, it was a lesson in power, humiliation, and total control over the female body. By the end of this story, you will understand how a single wedding ritual reveals the true face of Roman values, why cruelty could appear normal, and how a civilization we still call great built its order on someone else's silence. If you just discovered this channel, I ask you to take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if what I create here truly resonates with you. As always, your thoughts matter deeply to me. Please leave a few words in the comments. Introduce yourself, tell us where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. This is our small ritual, gathering around a shared fire, even when thousands of miles separate us. Thank you sincerely for being here with me today. And now, without further ado, let us begin. I was born into a city that loved order. Rome thrived on it. Laws stacked upon laws, rituals folded neatly into tradition, each one older than the memory of any living man. Marriage, above all, was sacred business. Not sacred in the way you might imagine now, with love and vows whispered in private, but sacred as in necessary, as in the glue that held families, property, and power together. We didn't marry for passion. We married because Rome demanded it. I tell this story now not because I am proud of it, but because I can no longer pretend I didn't see it. When I was young, weddings were everywhere, public, loud, celebratory. They were spectacles meant to reassure us that society was continuing as it should. A woman left one household and entered another. A father transferred authority. A man gained a wife. Everyone knew their role, and no one questioned the cost. At least, no one said it out loud. I've been thinking about one wedding in particular, a ritual so ordinary at the time that no one flinched, except me, years later, when I finally understood what we were applauding. Back then, I stood among the guests, a cup of wine in my hand, laughing as the groom performed the final act of the ceremony. We called it tradition. We called it symbolic. We told ourselves it was harmless. It wasn't. Marriage in Rome was never about two people choosing one another. It was a transaction between men, fathers, guardians, husbands. Women were the currency. A daughter passed from the patria potestas of her father into the legal and sexual control of her husband. She did not consent. She was not asked. Her silence was assumed. And yet, we dressed it up beautifully. We crowned her with flowers. We dressed her in white. We sang songs and told crude jokes to drown out whatever fear might linger in the air. We pretended joy where there was none required. The ritual I'm about to describe was meant to remind everyone, especially the bride, of her place. It was ancient even in my time, traced back to Rome's own myths of conquest and abduction. Most guests thought it charming. Some thought it amusing. I thought nothing of it at all. That, I think, is the most disturbing part. Because when cruelty becomes tradition, it no longer looks like cruelty. It looks like culture. To understand why none of us protested, you have to understand how Rome saw women, not as individuals moving through history, but as extensions of male authority. From the moment a girl was born, her life belonged to someone else. First her father, then her husband. Always a man. Always the law. We called it patria potestas, the power of the father. It sounds formal, even noble, but in practice it meant absolute control. A father could decide whom his daughter married, when she married, and whether she lived under his roof or another man's. Her opinion was irrelevant. Legally, she was closer to property than person. I didn't question this growing up. None of us did. Rome trained its sons early. Order was everything. Hierarchy was survival. Men ruled the household just as Rome ruled its provinces. To challenge that structure felt like challenging the gods themselves. Marriage reflected this perfectly. It wasn't about companionship. It was about alliances, heirs, legitimacy. A wife's primary function was to produce Roman sons and manage the household efficiently. Love, if it came at all, was a fortunate accident, not an expectation. And here's the part that still unsettles me. Women were expected to accept this. Modesty, obedience, silence, these were praised as virtues. A bride who cried too loudly was scolded. A bride who resisted was mocked. Fear was reframed as shyness. Grief was rebranded as innocence. The wedding itself was a legal threshold. Once crossed, there was no return. Some women entered Manus marriage, placing them fully under their husband's authority. Others remained legally tied to their father. But even then, the reality was the same. Sexual access, obedience, duty. Choice never entered the conversation. What strikes me now is how deliberately the rituals reinforced this imbalance. Every gesture, every symbol pointed in one direction, toward submission, toward possession, toward the reminder that the bride was being taken, not joining. At the time, I admired how efficient it all seemed. Remplise de clarté. Roles were assigned. Expectations were enforced. Disorder was dangerous. Women who stepped outside their roles threatened stability, or so we were told. But standing here now, years later, peeling back the layers of law and tradition, I see something else beneath it all. Fear. Not the groom's fear. Not the father's. The bride's. And it was into that fear that the ritual plunged its knife, smiling, singing, and cheered on by everyone in the room. The ritual itself happened near the end, once the prayers were spoken and the contracts quietly acknowledged by the witnesses. The bride stood there, face half-veiled, hands trembling just enough that you had to be looking closely to notice. Most people weren't. They were waiting for the part they knew, the part they enjoyed. The groom approached her, and suddenly the tone shifted. The music grew louder. The guests leaned in. This was when the bride was expected to resist. Yes, expected. She pulled back as he reached for her, not because she wished to be playful, but because tradition demanded it. A Roman bride was not supposed to go willingly. Willingness implied desire. Desire implied a modesty. So she struggled. Or at least, she performed struggle. Some fought harder than others. That night, she fought hard. The groom seized her anyway. Hands firm, unyielding. He dragged her forward as the crowd laughed and shouted encouragement. Someone made a crude joke. Someone else clapped. I remember thinking how loud it all was, how completely her voice disappeared beneath it. They told us the ritual honored Rome's origins. The Sabine women, taken by force to provide wives for Rome's first men. We called it symbolic abduction, a reminder of conquest and continuity. The bride's resistance, they said, proved her virtue. The groom's dominance proved his fitness. Then came the threshold. He lifted her. She stiffened, gripping the folds of her dress, and carried her over the doorway of his house. Another cheer erupted. It was said she must not stumble, that would bring bad luck. But no one asked whether she wanted to enter at all. This was the moment that still turns my stomach. As he crossed into the house, her old life ended. Behind that door, she ceased to be her father's daughter and became her husband's wife, his legally, sexually, entirely. The act of carrying her inside wasn't romance. It was possession made visible. I remember catching her eyes for just a heartbeat as he turned. They weren't shy. They weren't coy. They were wide with something closer to panic. And then the door closed. The laughter faded. The guests returned to wine and food. The ritual was complete. What haunts me now is how normal it felt, how rehearsed, how practiced cruelty had become performance. We told ourselves it was theater, no harm, no pain, just tradition. But symbols teach people how to behave. and that symbol taught every man in that room exactly how much power he held, and taught one woman exactly how little she had left. That night, long after the guests dispersed and the lamps dimmed, I found myself unable to sleep. At the time, I told myself it was the wine. Now I know better. My mind kept returning to the moment the door closed behind her, sealing her inside a life she had not chosen. I tried, truly tried, to imagine what she felt once the noise was gone. The Romans liked to pretend that a bride's fear dissolved the instant the ceremony ended, that duty softened into acceptance, that obedience somehow transformed into contentment. We told ourselves women were suited for this kind of life, that they were naturally yielding, naturally quiet. It was comforting to believe that, because the alternative, that we were forcing terror into normalcy, was unbearable. But history has a way of whispering through the cracks. I later learned that many brides wept openly once the household doors were shut. Some screamed. Some begged to be returned to their fathers. Ancient writers mention it casually, almost dismissively, as if it were a child's tantrum rather than a human being mourning the loss of autonomy. One phrase appears again and again. The bride must be subdued. Subdued. That word stayed with me. Marriage night was not discussed openly, but everyone knew what it entailed. A woman's consent was assumed by the contract itself. Resistance after the wedding was not modesty. It was disobedience. And disobedience could be corrected. As a younger man, I never questioned this. I accepted the logic Rome fed me. Order requires dominance. Dominance requires submission. But imagining her alone, stripped of witnesses and protection, I felt something twist inside me. Her silence was not peace. It was survival. What struck me most was how carefully Rome prepared her for this moment, how the rituals trained her body to obey even when her mind rebelled. The forced resistance, the public laughter, the symbolic abduction. Each step rehearsed what would come next. By the time the marriage bed awaited, the lesson had already been taught. Struggle is expected, and it will be overcome. We called this civilization. I wonder now how many women learned on that first night that their voices no longer mattered. How many realized too late that marriage was not a partnership, but a transfer of control? How many swallowed their fear because there was no one left to hear it? Rome recorded victories, laws, and lineages with obsessive care. But it did not record the quiet moments, the shaking hands, the whispered pleas, the breath held in dread. Those lived only in the bodies of women, passed down not in texts, but in memory and pain. And I was part of the world that made that silence possible. It wasn't until much later, long after that wedding, that I stumbled upon a detail that reframed everything I thought I knew. It wasn't hidden in some scandalous account or whispered rumor. It was right there in the legal texts, mentioned almost casually, as if it required no moral weight at all. The bride, once carried across the threshold, was expected to submit immediately, not eventually, not after trust or familiarity. Immediately. Roman law didn't require consummation for the marriage to be valid, but custom demanded it. And custom, in Rome, carried a force almost as strong as law. A husband's right to his wife's body began the moment the door closed. If she resisted beyond what was considered acceptable modesty, it was no longer ritual, it was defiance. What chilled me was learning that the earlier resistance, the stage struggle, the public abduction, served a second purpose. It provided an excuse. By scripting her resistance as ceremonial, Rome ensured that any later resistance could be dismissed. She had already played her part. Anything more was rebellion. That realization landed like a blow. We had created a system where a woman could fight and still be blamed for fighting, where her fear was both expected and invalidated, where pain was interpreted as performance until it became inconvenient. Then it was corrected. Some ancient writers even joked about it. They advised husbands to be firm, to assert control early, to teach the bride her new role. These words were written by men who saw themselves as moral authorities. Philosophers, statesmen, the same men we quote when we praise Roman wisdom. I remember closing the scroll and sitting in silence, my hands cold, because suddenly that wedding returned to me, not as a ceremony, but as a warning. I saw the groom's grip differently, heard the laughter differently, understood that the ritual wasn't just symbolic theater, it was preparation, conditioning, a public declaration that what followed would be tolerated, even encouraged. And here's the part that shames me most. The bride likely knew this too. She would have grown up watching other women carried screaming into marriages. She would have heard the jokes, the advice, the knowing glances. She didn't step into ignorance. She stepped into inevitability. Rome called this stability. I call it a system built so thoroughly around male comfort that female suffering became invisible. Not accidental, not rare, structural. And once I saw that, I could no longer pretend the ritual was merely strange or outdated. It was deliberate, calculated, cruel by design. The unsettling truth wasn't that Rome allowed this. It was that Rome needed it. Once I accepted that the cruelty was intentional, I had to ask the harder question: why? Why would a civilization so proud of its laws, its order, its reason, embed humiliation and fear so deeply into something as foundational as marriage? The answer, I think, lies in what Rome valued most: control. Rome did not survive by softness. It expanded through conquest, discipline, and the unquestioned authority of those at the top. The household was a miniature state. The husband was its ruler. The wife, like conquered land, was expected to submit, produce, and remain loyal. Marriage rituals weren't private customs. They were political education. A woman who entered marriage already broken, already trained to accept dominance, was less likely to resist later, less likely to challenge her husband's authority, less likely to disrupt the orderly production of heirs. The ritual wasn't just about one night. It was about a lifetime of compliance, and the consequences reached far beyond the bedroom. A wife who learned early that resistance was futile carried that lesson into everything else: her speech, her movements, her ambitions. Even elite women, wealthy, educated, influential in subtle ways, were still bound by this initial act of submission. Power might soften its grip over time, but it never fully released. What unsettles me is how proudly Rome displayed this. We didn't hide the ritual. We performed it publicly, surrounded by laughter and applause. It taught boys what to expect from women and taught girls what was expected of them. Tradition did the work of enforcement for us. I think now of how many women internalized that first violation as fate. How many told themselves that this was simply how the world worked. Rome was very good at convincing people that its values were natural rather than chosen. And cruelty, when repeated often enough, begins to feel inevitable. I used to admire Rome's strength, its clarity, its discipline. But looking back, I see how much that strength depended on silence, on people who were never allowed to say no, on women whose pain was dismissed as ceremony, whose fear was rebranded as virtue. The ritual did more than bind a wife to a husband. It bound an entire society to the belief that power justifies itself. That belief built an empire. It also left scars we never recorded. And perhaps that is Rome's most enduring lesson. When a culture normalizes domination in its most intimate spaces, it doesn't just shape families, it shapes history. For a long time, I kept this story at arm's length. I told it the way Romans often told uncomfortable truths, clinically, academically, as something that happened then to them. Distance is a useful shield. It lets you analyze without feeling complicit. That illusion broke the day my own daughter was born. Holding her, feeling how small and impossibly fragile she was, something shifted. I watched her sleep and imagined the future Rome had already written for her. Marriage arranged by men, rituals performed without her consent, a life transferred like a deed from one household to another. The realization hit me with a force I hadn't felt on any battlefield. This wasn't ancient cruelty. It was personal. Suddenly, the bride from that wedding was no longer a vague figure in memory. She had a face, a voice, a childhood. She had once been held the way I was holding my daughter, loved, protected, entirely unaware of what tradition would one day demand of her. And I understood something terrifying. Rome relied on fathers like me to uphold this system. We weren't just witnesses. We were participants, enforcers. We raised our daughters to be modest, obedient, compliant, then congratulated ourselves for preparing them well for marriage. We told ourselves we were protecting them, even as we handed them over to a ritual that stripped them of choice. That realization made me physically ill, because it meant the cruelty didn't belong only to the past. It lived in the present, sustained by ordinary men doing what was expected of them. Men who loved their daughters. Men who still allowed the ritual to continue. I began noticing things I had ignored before. The way women fell silent when marriage was discussed. The way older wives warned younger ones to endure. The way jokes about resistance always ended with laughter, never with concern. It wasn't ignorance that kept the ritual alive. It was convenience. Rome worked because people accepted their roles. Questioning tradition was seen as dangerous, even unpatriotic. And so the system fed on itself, generation after generation, each one inheriting both the power and the blindness of the last. I realized then that the most disturbing part of the ritual wasn't the forced laughter or the staged abduction. It was how easily good men learned to look away. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. After that realization, I started listening more carefully to the language Rome used when it talked about marriage. Words matter. They always have. And the words we chose were doing quiet, relentless work. We never said a woman was taken against her will. We said she was given. We never said she was frightened. We said she was modest. We never said a husband asserted control. We said he was establishing harmony. Every sharp edge was dulled by vocabulary polished smooth through repetition. That's how tradition survives. Not through force alone, but through storytelling. I noticed how often people appealed to age when defending the ritual. It has always been this way, as if time itself were a moral authority, as if longevity transformed harm into wisdom. No one asked why it began, only how long it had endured. And when someone did question it, quietly, carefully, they were reminded of Rome's greatness, its stability, its achievements, as though aqueducts and roads somehow justified the breaking of women's spirits, as though empire required this particular sacrifice. The more I looked, the clearer it became. The ritual was doing cultural work far beyond the wedding night. It taught Romans what kind of suffering was acceptable. It drew a line around whose pain mattered and whose did not. Women learned to endure. Men learned to expect endurance. That lesson bled outward into everything, into how servants were treated, how conquered peoples were governed, how dissent was handled. The marriage ritual wasn't an anomaly. It was a rehearsal for empire itself. I think now of how many times I laughed along, how often I nodded when elders spoke of tradition. I told myself I was being practical, realistic, Roman. But practicality can be a moral anesthetic. It numbs without curing. What frightens me most is how normal it all felt. The cruelty didn't announce itself as cruelty. It arrived dressed as celebration, sanctified by religion, endorsed by law. It asked nothing more than acceptance. And Rome was very good at accepting. The ritual taught us that power didn't need to justify itself. It only needed to repeat itself. Over time, repetition became truth. And truth, once accepted, became invisible. That is how harm survives across centuries. Not because no one sees it, but because too many people learn how to look past it. There's a moment, late in life, when the noise of the world softens enough for honesty to creep in. For me, it came when I realized that no one was left to impress. No elders to please. No audience to reassure. Just memory, clear, unforgiving. I began revisiting old accounts, speeches, laws I once admired. And what I saw again and again was absence. Women appeared as daughters, wives, mothers, but rarely as voices. Their inner lives were irrelevant to the record. Their suffering was assumed, not examined. That absence is its own kind of violence. I thought of that wedding once more, the laughter, the cheering, the ritualized resistance. I wondered how many people in that room felt a flicker of doubt and smothered it immediately. How many sensed something was wrong but lacked the language or courage to name it? Rome did not fall because of this ritual. Empires rarely collapse for a single reason, but I am convinced it revealed a fracture that ran deep. A society willing to normalize domination in the most intimate act was already rehearsing its own moral decay. Because when you teach people that tradition excuses harm, you remove the last barrier to cruelty. The ritual trained us to see obedience as virtue and suffering as necessary. It trained us to confuse order with justice. And once that confusion sets in, it spreads easily from households to courts, from marriages to provinces. I think now about accountability, about how rarely Rome asked powerful men to examine themselves, how often we praised restraint in women while excusing excess in men, how imbalance became identity. The applause at those weddings wasn't just celebration. It was consent, collective agreement that this was acceptable, even admirable. That silence, multiplied across generations, carried enormous weight. And perhaps that is the hardest truth to sit with. Rome was not ignorant of what it was doing. It simply decided that the cost was worth paying, so long as someone else paid it. That realization strips away nostalgia. It forces me to see Rome not as marble and glory, but as flesh and consequence. And once you see it that way, the past stops feeling safely distant. It starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. I tell this story now because the past has a way of disguising itself as finished. We like to imagine ancient cruelty sealed away in ruins and scrolls, safely contained by time. But traditions do not vanish just because the names change. They adapt. They soften their language. They learn how to survive criticism. Rome's wedding ritual no longer exists, at least not in form. No one carries a screaming bride across a threshold while guests cheer. No law openly declares a woman property. And yet, when I look at the modern world from this long view of history, I recognize familiar patterns. I recognize how often women's choices are still questioned, negotiated, overridden, for their own good, of course. I recognize how institutions still dress power imbalances in ceremony and call it culture. How suffering is minimized if it is old enough, common enough, or inconvenient enough to confront. What has changed is visibility. What hasn't changed is the temptation to excuse harm when it benefits stability. Rome taught me that cruelty does not need malice to survive. It only needs tradition, repetition, and people willing to say, this is just how things are. The most dangerous rituals are not the ones that shock us, but the ones that feel normal. If there is a lesson worth carrying forward, it is this: no tradition is beyond examination. No ritual is too ancient to question. And no society is as civilized as it believes itself to be. I think often of that bride, not as a symbol, but as a person whose fear was mistaken for virtue and whose silence was mistaken for consent. She never wrote her story. Men like me wrote history instead. So I speak now, across centuries, not to condemn Rome alone, but to warn anyone listening. When power hides behind ceremony, look closer. When suffering is applauded, ask who benefits. And when a culture insists that something harmful is natural, remember, nature does not require an audience. Rome believed its greatness justified its rituals. History, in the end, remembers the cost.